Hi folks, and welcome to the A Minute to Midnight show. This is your host Tony, and today on the show I have first time guest John and Joy Heasman. Joy does most of the teaching and speaking in this particular interview, and it's very interesting. Lots of things I didn't know, particularly as it gets further on into the interview. I learned a lot, and this is probably the first of 3 interviews I think that I'll be doing with him, hopefully between now and Christmas. Hope you enjoy it. Definitely a lot of stuff to learn from these two people. I want to offer a very warm welcome to John and Joy Heasman from Australia. I think you guys may be the first Australians I've interviewed on the show, from memory. I could be wrong. But anyway, it's nice to be talking to you today.
Well, it's good because we've got all the Anzac traditions in common.
True, we do, yes. Yep, absolutely. So perhaps you two can just give a bit of a description to our audience of who you are, and then we'll talk about what the topic is.
Well, I'll introduce myself a little bit, and then I'll just let John introduce where he was born and how come he ended up in Australia. I'm the chatterbox in the family. John's the researcher. John's the editor-in-chief, and John's the brains. I'm the chatterbox. My expertise has been mainly history, whereas John has worked for Voice of the Martyrs. He's worked for Richard Wurmbrand. He knows a lot about the background of communism. And he's also worked as an engineer, electrical engineer. So John's got a lot of expertise that I don't have. My background is that my family came to Australia as convicts from Ireland, and I grew up on a very small, poor farm. But by a miracle, absolute miracle, I ended up with a scholarship that took me to Teachers College in Sydney. And then, amazingly, after that, after teaching for several years, I was able to go back to university and get a history degree. And history has become a real passion because that fits in with my love of Scripture. And my love of Scripture started when I was 14, out on the little farm in the middle of nowhere. I came from a family who didn't know anything about God or the Bible. My dad, coming from Ireland, in his background, I think he knew the first line of the Hail Mary, but that's about all I knew. And then I almost died of burst appendix in the middle of the night out in the farm, and I was rushed to way to a hospital, and I just got really scared. I thought, what happens when you die? And I thought, I just really was frightened. So somehow or other, I got hold of a Bible. I found out about God as our creator and father, and that he sent Jesus to be our redeemer and offer us eternal life. So every day since then, I've read the Bible, and the Bible has become the passion of my life, and my love of history fits in with how the Bible is, all the prophecies of Bible are being fulfilled in front of our very eyes right now.
Great. And John, what's your story?
My story is that I was born in England during the Battle of Britain in 1940. And my father was a lieutenant in the British Army. He was captured at Dunkirk, so I didn't meet him until I was 5 years old. And then after the war, I think Dad felt that there was not much future in England. So his sister had already come out to Australia, so he decided to pack us all up and bring us out here, which we did. That was 1948. So I grew up in Melbourne. I graduated from the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in mechanical engineering. But later on, most of my career was in the electricity, what was then the Electricity Commission of New South Wales, at a major power station. So when I retired, I eventually, I won't go into all the details of marriages and so forth, but Joy and I have been married now for 13 years, and it's been an extremely good match. We complement each other very, very well. I think that's all I need to say.
And in another show, not today, we will be talking to you about the 5G technology and things. So that's going to be really interesting. Just giving people a heads up that is a future show in the not too distant future, because John knows a lot about that stuff. Okay, now, so you guys have been kind of researching and doing this for a long time. Do you want to tell our audience what the main topic is today, and then give us a bit of a background into why?
Well, I guess it all started when I went to university in Sydney, the University of New South Wales, in 1972. And it was there at university that suddenly I saw the Bible prophecy being fulfilled. As I studied modern history, I could see the Bible just jumping off the page. And there was like a light bulb moment when I was in the university archives with thousands of stacks of books and journals. And I just happened to come across, like a needle in a haystack, the journals of the Carnegie Institute, the Rockefeller Endowment, Carnegie Ford Foundation, and they, way back in the 1890s and early 1900s, there were the details of the planning of the First World War and the planning of a one world government. And I thought, my goodness, this is what Revelation says will happen. You know, it talks about a time where you won't be able to buy or sell without taking the mark. It talks about worldwide government, talks about wars and rumors of wars. And here it was all being planned by what we would call the top capitalists in the world. The journals of the Carnegie Institute, they were actually brought before Congress in the Church Committee, the 50s and 60s, to investigate the incredible power that these tax-free foundations had on American foreign policy. And so this was all brought, it's all documented in the archives now of the US Congress and those committees. But I found it in the archives of the University of New South Wales. And what really shocked me was that we had been studying Nazism and communism and Karl Marx and Lenin and Stalin and all of this, and they wanted a one world communist international. We'd been studying the rise of Islam, and they want a one world Islamic government. But when I came across what I thought were the super capitalists, you know, the Fords, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and they were talking about, we've got to have a one world government, I thought, there's a common theme here.
Yeah. Yes.
So that really put me on a big search, and it inspired a lot of my history degree. We had a choice of doing our history exams, of like sitting down and saying name, place, and dates of the First World War and the Second World War, etc. Or we could do a research projects and get marked on our research projects. I chose the latter, and I was able to do amazing research projects that took a lot more time than it would have just to sit for an exam. But I was able to relate the topics to biblical prophecy and to biblical principles and morality. So I am so thankful for the opportunity to have been able to I had 3 babies in the years that I did my history degree. So it took me from 1972 to 1980 to actually get my history degree, in modern history degree. But at the same time, I was also studying at an evangelical theological college in Sydney, which gave me a wonderful background in biblical exegesis and how to understand the Bible correctly. So I was able to put my university studies and my theological biblical studies, I was able to marry them together in a wonderful way.
And then later on you went to Jerusalem too, didn't you?
I did, and that was because the University of New South Wales said that nothing of importance in history happened before 1600. So there was no opportunity to do any ancient history or biblical history, which I absolutely loved. So at the University of New South Wales, they really started with the Reformation, and that so overlapped with my theological studies. That was just wonderful. I loved all the Reformation history, and then the history that led up to the 20th century history. But I still, when I finished all of that, I still had this passion to study ancient history. And my daughters had left home and gone to university, and I had given up teaching, and I had an opportunity to go and study at a Messianic Bible College in Jerusalem. And I am so, so thankful for that opportunity, because that just were so many light bulb moments and so many divine appointments that just changed my life forever.
So you met a lot of pretty interesting people in Israel, didn't you?
Oh, my goodness. I mean, I can only describe them as absolutely divine appointments that I could never have orchestrated myself. But they're obviously things God wanted to teach me. People had stories to tell me that I guess I see my job as putting all the pieces of the puzzle together to show the big picture of what's happening in prophetic fulfillment and what's unfolding in history and the news before our very eyes. I guess one of the first light bulb moments that happened before I went to Israel, while I was still studying at New South Wales, when I realised that it wasn't only the communists that wanted a one world government, it was the capitalists as well. And I came across a book by Anthony Sutton, and I've got a picture of Anthony, and he is an academic with an amazing background, military background, an academic background, a historian, and he wrote the most wonderful books on the funding of Hitler. It's Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, and he also wrote one on how Wall Street funded the communists, how the Wall Street funded the whole communist thing from beginning right through Stalin, and studying which companies made which nuts and bolts of the Nazi war machine. That opened my eyes. That really, really opened my eyes, because at the time I thought communism, this was back in 1972, I thought communism was the threat, because I was reading Richard Wurmbrand's work and others who were getting aid to the persecuted Christians behind the Iron Curtain. And I was reading what was happening in China, and my heart grieved. I thought communism is just so anti-God. Why are they so anti-God? Not realizing at the time that John was, it was actually at the time that John was working with Richard Wurmbrand, going into Romania and getting scriptures to be distributed in Eastern Europe. So John saw communism firsthand behind the Iron Curtain. But at the time, what answered my question as to why communists were so intent on incarcerating and killing Christians was Richard Wurmbrand's little booklet, Was Karl Marx an Atheist? And that little book documented Karl Marx's religious beliefs.
He was basically a Luciferian, wasn't he?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that was the first thing that made any sense to me. And since then, John and I have done a lot of research on not only Karl Marx and who was funding him, but Mao. And, you could just go on and on. But that was the first clue that I got about the Luciferian agenda behind what I was studying.
And so what about when you did get to Israel, then then who did you sort of meet there that was pretty important?
Well, that was absolutely amazing, because within a very short period of time of arriving at Bible college, I met almost half a dozen people who were absolutely key to my future and to the research that John and I have since done. While at Bible college, we were given a room. We were allowed to rent a room in a family home, and renting the next door room was a man from the Full Gospel Businessmen's Association. Have you heard of that, Tony?
Yeah, we had the Full Gospel Businessmen's Association in New Zealand. I'm not sure if it's still going or not, but I certainly remember it from the 90s anyway.
Okay, so this was 1996, and this man was staying in the next room. So, of course, we chatted over meals. And I had read Demas Shakarian's book, The Happiest People on Earth, and he was the man who started the Full Gospel Businessmen's Association. He was an Armenian. And the book, The Happiest People on Earth, if you've not read that book, it is really, really worthwhile reading that book, The Happiest People on Earth, because it describes how Demas Shakarian's family escaped the Armenian Holocaust and how he came to start the Full Gospel Businessmen's Association. But the interesting thing that this man told me was Demas had just died not long before that, and the man I met, I can't remember his name now, he had taken over from Demas in the Full Gospel Business Association, and he was a very close friend of Demas. And he told me not only the story that I'd already read in Demas's book, was that there was a boy prophet in Armenia in the 1850s who was given a prophecy that a time of great trouble would come to Armenia, but God had a place of protection and provision for them. And this boy was illiterate. He was 11, and he was shown like a movie like a video on the wall. He couldn't read or write, so he copied it down. It was in Russian because they were Russian Pentecostals. There'd been a Pentecostal revival in Russia that had spilt over into Armenia, brought by a Russian Pentecostal prophet. And they were very, very godly people. And this young boy, in a time of prayer, saw this vision. He copied down the words and the map, and the words were saying a time of great trouble is going to come to Armenia in the future. And this is a map of where I have provided provision and protection for you. And It was a map of North America. And this message went all over Armenia to every village. For 50 years, God sent out the warning, trouble is coming, great trouble is coming. And I've got a place of protection and provision for you, and I'll send the prophet to tell you the time when it is I want you to leave. So that was about 1900, and people thought that all the Armenian Christians would leave because of this warning, but in the end, only about 10,000 got on ships and they went to North America, they were shown a map. Yeah. And in the word it said they would be disembarking on the east coast, but they were to go and settle on the west coast, and God would provide land for them because they were cattle farmers, and they became very wealthy cattle farmers. And then real estate. The prophecy said God would bless them in this land. But most of the rest of the Armenians said, but this is our homeland. We don't want to leave. How do we know this prophecy is true? And of course, the rest is history. At least 1.5 million Armenians were massacred by the Turks during the First World War in 1916. And John and I have recently done a lot of research into that. And it just makes you want to absolutely cry.
Yeah, it's pretty horrendous, all right. Just backtracking for a second, John, you must have been pretty amazing to work with Richard Wurmbrand. I mean, he was a bit of a legend too. I read Tortured for Christ and things in the past, so must have been pretty amazing working with him.
It was, Tony. It all started the same way, by reading the book. When I read the book at first, I thought, this is ridiculous. This is the 20th century. This can't be happening. Yeah. And it wasn't until he came to Australia in 66 or 67, and I heard him speak at Katoomba, that I realised he was absolutely telling the truth. And then we got involved from Australia. We were at one stage sending New Testaments with so fine a print that you had to use a magnifying glass to read them. And we were posting them in to the Soviet Union at random from a telephone book smuggled out of the Soviet Union. So we got involved with all that sort of stuff. And anyway, cutting a long story short, eventually I'd settled in Canada, and I got a phone call one day from Michael Wurmbrand, that's Richard's son, who was asking me whether I would be willing to go to New Zealand to take over the work there, because they were having problems. I think the previous man wanted to get out and they didn't have anyone to replace him. So we prayed about it, and yes, we ended up in New Zealand between 77, I think it was 77 and 81. Yeah. So I headed up the ministry. It was originally based in New Plymouth, but I re-established it in Auckland, right, just on the outskirts at Howick, which I understand has now become known as Chowick.
Yes, it has. I haven't been there for about 10 years or something, but yes, it's very Chinese from my understanding. Yeah. Okay, so now going back, moving on again, like, you had made a friend with somebody who worked for the World Bank, Joy, didn't you?
Yes.
And have some info on Henry Kissinger, for example.
Yes. Now that was absolutely such a divine appointment. At another time, another place, Tony, I'll tell you about the other tremendous answer to prayer in meeting. His name was John Hulley. He was a Harvard graduate, one of the top economists at the World Bank at the time, and he worked with his big boss was Henry Kissinger, and his immediate boss was Robert McNamara, who was not only head of the World Bank, but he oversaw the Vietnam War. And meeting John answered all the Bible study that I'd been doing before I went. But Tony, I'd have to tell you that story another time. But meeting John and finding out about what was going on at the World Bank and Henry Kissinger, that was mind-blowing. I mean, in one sense, my history studies and reading Anthony Sutton, reading Richard Wurmbrand had prepared me to know that it was Wall Street that was funding the communists and it was Wall Street that was funding Hitler. But meeting John Hulley, having worked on the very inside of the World Bank, he was a very high-level economist, worked on top projects, but he was a believer. And Henry Kissinger asked him to do something that he couldn't in all conscience do. Now, Tony, I don't know if you remember that in 1973 there was an oil crisis, world war crisis.
I actually do remember that. I was, only a kid, but I do, yes.
Well, John was asked by Henry Kissinger to orchestrate that, to organise that, and to justify that. But John knew the whole background to that, and it was that Henry Kissinger had asked OPEC to put up their prices, oil prices, by 400%. And OPEC, including Saudi Arabia and so on, oil-producing countries, had said to Henry Kissinger, we can't suddenly put up our oil prices by 400%. America or Britain or Europe or Russia or somebody will put put sanctions on us. We can't do this. And John heard Henry Kissinger assure OPEC, I personally give you my guarantee that no country will put sanctions on you. And John thought to himself, how can Henry Kissinger speak on behalf of the governments of the whole world? How can he guarantee? And what John figured out was that every country is in debt to the World Bank. Mm. And so it's through debt. Henry Kissinger was really saying the World Bank controls every nation and every government through debt, through massive debt, and they'll do what we say. And recently, John and I watched this amazing documentary called Big Oil. It's the Corbett Report, and it goes into great detail about all that John Hulley told me about personally. He goes into it from just historical documents, but John told me the story personally. And in the Corbett Report, an American interviewer says to the King of Saudi Arabia, why have you created this oil crisis and put the prices up 400%? Why have you done this? And the Saudi king says to the American reporter, you go and ask your king and ask Henry Kissinger.
That's interesting, yeah. Very interesting.
And so out of that has come all the oil agreements and the financial agreements, and, all the trading has been done in American dollars. Until recently, Iran rebelled against that, and Russia has now rebelled against that. But that set the stage for. That was 73, wasn't it? 1973. So since 73, that agreement that John was supposed to be involved. Henry Kissinger said, John, you write a paper proving that this oil price rise is a good thing for the world. And John thought, I can't do that. It's a good thing for the oil companies. It's a good thing for the bank, but it's not a good thing for the people or nations. And John was getting very nervous. He thought, who am I working for? How come Henry Kissinger has got so much power? And so
it's amazing how much power he still has too at 96 or whatever he is.
He's been advising every president, yeah,
absolutely. And the people that, go and have a look at him sitting with Donald Trump in the White House, and the people that think Donald Trump's against the world government. Come on, folks. Take a good look how many times Kissinger has been there and how many times Trump has called him his good friend. Anyway, I digress. But
absolutely. And that has been the case with every president.
Yeah.
It's almost daily phone calls to Kissinger. And so John thought, who am I working for? How come this man has got so much power? And when he refused to do what Henry Kissinger asked him to do in justifying this oil price rise, he sort of got put in the corner, naughty boy, smack your hand, we're not going to give you any more work. And so he spent 2 years investigating who Henry Kissinger was and who he worked for and where he got his power from. And the conclusion, John Hulley.
What was his last name, John's last name?
John Hulley, Hulley. I've got a picture there for you.
Yep.
And John said to John and I, when we visited him before he died, he said, if anyone had told me beforehand what I was to discover, I would have laughed them to scorn. I would not have believed it. But because his life depended upon it, he actually ended up with death threats. He said, I had to find out who I was working for. And the conclusion that he came to was that Henry Kissinger was really only the bus driver for the big boys. And who were the big boys? Well, that was Rockefeller and Rothschild and, J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs. But what shocked John to the point of leaving the USA was that he discovered they were Luciferian. They worshipped Lucifer, and they had the plan not only to control every country by getting them into debt through the World Bank and through the Bank of International Settlements and the International Monetary Agency, not only controlling all the money, but controlling the oil, controlling the world's resources, that they wanted a one world government and a one world Luciferian religion. And when John realized that, he knew he had to get out of America. His life was threatened, and that's how he ended up in Israel. And another time, Tony, I'll tell you another part of the story, because in Israel, he was an amazing, amazing historian, going back into all the ancient migrations of all 12 tribes of Israel. So he used his genius to work for the Lord and for understanding biblical history and biblical prophecy instead of working for Henry Kissinger. And his friends said to him, John, you're mad living in Jerusalem. You'll get blown up in a bus. And his reply was, I tell you what, it's much safer living in Israel than living in Washington.
That's a very interesting. Yeah. Now, what about Israel then, and basically the third temple and the building of the plans for that? Do you know much about that?
Yes. Now, one of John's friends was Rabbi Chaim Rickman, and he is the head of the Temple Institute. And I went to the Temple Institute, and I went to see all of the implements and things that they're making. I could tell you many stories, and maybe another time, Tony, of just the amazing things that are being prepared for the Third Temple. In meeting Rabbi Rickman in 96, 97, 98, those years that I was living there, he would have said at that time, I want to rebuild the temple for the God of Israel, and to fulfill biblical prophecy, and to, Moses. But recently, Tony, you had a clip of an interview with Rabbi Rickman, and so I haven't seen him since the late 90s. And he's changed so much, Tony, because now he's talking much more about the temple being for the one world religion. They talk about now the temple as being the house of prayer for all nations, yes. Meaning all religions.
Yeah, I think, I can't remember. It's in one of the videos I made. I think it was perhaps one I'd done about Donald Trump or something.
Was.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I actually included that interview, and it was a bit of an eye-opener. Very new age.
Very
yeah, yes.
Very, very new age. And Tony, that comes from these particular rabbis being really saturated in the Kabbalah.
Yeah. Yes, what do you know about that?
Well, it's interesting. A friend of mine bought a book from the Temple Institute, and it's by a Kabbalistic rabbi. Again, we would call him very New Agey. And this is like an official publication of the Temple Institute by one of their rabbis. But he, as a Kabbalist, he had a picture of the Kabbalistic tree of life in the book, and relating to how the temple, rebuilding the temple would, bring together all religions, it would bring together all nations. And the Kabbalah is so contrary to Scripture. I was sitting on the bus going from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, and I was talking to a young man, and I said to him, "What do you do?" And he said, "Oh, I'm the librarian at the Hebrew University." And I said, "Oh, what did you study?" He said, "Jewish mysticism." And I said, What aspect?" And he said, "Kabbalah." And I said, "Oh, tell me about Kabbalah." So he started describing Kabbalah to me, and I thought, my goodness, this sounds like Canaanite paganism mixed with Freemasonry. So I said to him, which do you follow? Do you follow the Torah or do you follow Kabbalah? They seem incompatible. And he said, "Oh, I've given up believing in God and the Bible because the Kabbalah is actually so contrary to everything in Scripture." Since then, John and I have done a lot of study on the history of Kabbalah, and that's quite complicated, but it's the very basis of all the Freemasonry symbols.
Okay, so you did meet a Freemason who shared a lot of the history and the future plans for the temple, I believe.
Yes, now that was absolutely amazing. I was at a Passover meal in Galilee, and sitting next to me was a nice man, and we were all just chatting over the dinner table. And I had mentioned that a friend of mine had told me, an American friend of mine who I met in Israel, had told me that Bill and Hillary were very much into Kabbalah and Freemasonry. And this particular friend, she knew so much because her father was a very, very high-level military man and had gone over to the dark side. So this lady, her name was Pamela Schufert, and she has been trying to warn American Christians and Jews what her own father became involved in by becoming a Freemason, by becoming a Luciferian, by becoming into the Kabbalah, and the dark side of who's infiltrated the Pentagon. So she had told me about Bill and Hillary being involved in Kabbalah and Freemasonry, and I'd mentioned that over the dinner table, not realising there was a Freemason sitting next to me. But I could have got myself into a lot of trouble. Yeah. But God used it for good, because after the dinner, after we got up from the table, he came over to me and he started just chatting. And he said, "Oh, yes," he said, we trace our history as Freemasons back to the building of the first temple. Solomon and Hiram sent down the stonemasons and the carpenters and the cedars of Lebanon, and that's when Freemasonry began, with Solomon and Hiram and the building of the temple. And he said, our whole reason for being is to rebuild the next temple. And then he said something really interesting. He said, if you want to really know the bottom line or the end game, he said, you've got to read a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail. And I didn't get to read that for several years because it's quite an expensive book. It's a Freemasonry book. And it details all of the histories of all of the royal families of Europe. But it's based on a whole huge lie that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had a daughter, and that this Merovingian dynasty has married into all the royal families of Europe. And it goes into great detail. And the book is actually very accurate in terms of who was king of who and where and when. But it's all based on this lie that Mary Magdalene and Jesus had a child, and that's who they want to enthrone as Messiah and King of Israel, somebody from this bloodline. That's what he was telling me. That's why they want to build the temple. And in 2010, was it, John? We went with some dear friends to Jerusalem, and we were taken to the Austrian hospice, which I've sent you some photos of this. And we were taken into the chapel. And as you go into this building, it says, "Welcome to the Holy Shrine of the Holy Family." You know, the Holy Family, you think of Mary, Jesus, and Joseph. But when you get up close to this picture, you realize it's not. It's Mary Magdalene with a daughter, because she's got stockinged feet when you look closely at the picture, and James pointing west. Take this child west. And so this building was built in about 1852, 59, by Franz Joseph, who was the emperor, the Habsburg emperor of Vienna, and he inherited the title King of Jerusalem because his ancestors were part of the Knights Templar and Crusaders, and so he inherited the title King of Jerusalem. And our guide told us that he not only wanted his palace in Vienna, which I've been to, talk about gold and silver and wealth, but I need a palace in Jerusalem. It was never actually used as a palace. It's now called the Austrian Hospice. Is quite an elite place to go and stay. But we were taken into the chapel and shown this picture. So what Franz Joseph as a Habsburg was proclaiming, I am of the Holy Family. My bloodline is the Merovingian bloodline. I've got the right to be the King of Jerusalem, which is like covered in this book, really, that the Freemason man told me about, that if I wanted to understand the agenda, it's the bloodline. It's the bloodline of who we want to proclaim king in our rebuilt temple. And
very, very interesting. How does that fit in with the Knights Templar?
Very, very much. On that same visit, John and I were taken to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that's where Queen Helena, who was the mother of Constantine, where she declared Jesus rose from the dead. But when you go into there, it feels very creepy. They say this is where Jesus was buried, but actually you find out who was really buried there was the first Crusader king of Jerusalem, and his name was Godfrey of Bouillon.
Yeah.
And we were taken into the priest's change room, and John took some amazing pictures. In behind the door is Godfrey of Bouillon's sword, spurs, and a big stone block from his palace in Bouillon in France. And so he was the first Crusader king, and that title got passed down. Eventually, Franz Joseph inherited that as King of Jerusalem. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire was defeated in World War I, that title was passed to Juan Carlos, to the Spanish royal family, who also claim a right to to the throne of David. But it's very interesting because I think they still use that sword to knight the knights of the Knights Templar to this day. And the Knights Templar to this day are in very high places, Tony, very high.
Have they got connections with the Rosicrucians?
Very much so. They're all interconnected. When you go through the history from the Crusades, you've got the history of the formation of the Jesuits, the Rosicrucians, the Knights Templar, and all of that history of the 14, 15, 1600s. Tony, that is amazing history because it gives you the whole background of the Rosicrucians, the Loyola, who started the Jesuits, and the whole agenda behind that, and how all of these agendas fit together. And although the Jesuits claim that they are there to defend the Vatican, they're actually intending in the long run to betray. You've got the Black Pope, who was a Jesuit, and so for the first time now we've got a Pope who is a Jesuit.
Yeah, a white Pope and a black Pope, both. Yeah, two Jesuits, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But all of that history, Tony, of how how the Knights Templar, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, how all of that fits together and how that influenced the whole banking system of Europe, the setting up of the Swiss banks, the Friday the 13th, when the popes and kings who were indebted to the Knights Templar, who got all this gold from when they got to Solomon's temple, under the temple, they got all this gold and they became the bankers of Europe. And all the kings and popes became indebted to the Knights Templar, and they were so powerful that the king of France and the Pope, and, you know, they wanted their debts cancelled. So they said, we're going to disband the Knights Templar. Well, they had the best intelligence agency in Europe. They knew all this plan. So they escaped with the money to Switzerland and set up the Swiss banking system. They escaped to Scotland, where eventually that became Scottish Freemasonry and the building of the Rosslyn Chapel. In the 1400s, they set up in the City of London, which is the square mile in the centre of the City of London, independent city. They set up the British banking system and they set up the British legal system, the bar system, and built the Temple Church, which is a replica of the Holy Sepulchre Church. So all of this history in the 1400s, the 1500s, it lays the foundation for all the power players who we're seeing on the world stage now.
John, have you got any thoughts to add here?
No, I think Joy's covered it fairly well.
So what about Hebron? Oh, sorry, yeah?
Hebron, yes. The Hebron thing was very, very interesting, and John has found, I'll get him to bring it up in front of my eyes, John has found some wonderful pictures for me on Hebron, because when I arrived, Rabin had just been killed. Remember, Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated, and this was another interesting person that I met, and his name was Barry Hamish. Starts with CH, but CH is often her, very Hamish. And he had just written a book on the death of Rabin. And the story in the newspaper was that he had been killed by a religious fanatic right-wing Jew. In fact, it turns out that the orders for his death had come from Henry Kissinger and Shimon Peres. And there's a whole long story to tell you why that happened. But Barry had written a book on that. And it was through Barry that I learned a lot more of what was going on behind Israeli politics. And Barry's life was constantly in danger because he knew too much. But at that time, Prime Minister, after the death of Rabin, the deal with Kissinger was that Peres would replace Rabin, because Peres said he would hand over the Golan Heights immediately. But in an amazing turn of events, Netanyahu was elected instead of Peres. And Netanyahu had been elected on the promise that he would never give away Hebron, because Hebron is the city, of the patriarchs, where Abraham and the matriarchs and patriarchs are buried. Hebron was where David was. It was David's capital, before he came to Jerusalem. So Hebron was the second most holy city, and Netanyahu had absolutely, sincerely, unequivocally promised in the election, I will never give away Hebron. Well, one of my flatmates, she had worked in Washington. She'd worked as a press secretary for Bush Sr. until she found out from behind the scenes what things were going on. And she too thought, I've got to get out of Washington. And she came to live in Israel because she was a Messianic Jewish believer. But in Israel, she was working as a helper with military intelligence. And she, one night in January of 97, she said, Joy, do you know anyone who'd be still awake? This was about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. Is there anyone in the world that you know around the clock? Because I've just found out tomorrow morning Hebron's going to be given away. So I rang whoever I thought might still be up, given the changes of the times around the world. And lo and behold, next morning, the headline news was Netanyahu goes back on his promise. He's giving away Hebron today. And so the Knesset didn't know, the Parliament didn't know, the Cabinet didn't know. No one knew. It was on the orders of Henry Kissinger that Hebron had to be given away on that particular date. Now, Netanyahu obviously didn't know that when he was campaigning and promising never to give away Hebron. And another friend of mine who was a Messianic Jewish believer, he just happened to be in Washington in a lift. And Netanyahu got in the lift just after he'd been elected, and he had come out of a meeting with Henry Kissinger, got in the lift, and my friend said Netanyahu's face was white, absolutely white. He was scared. He was obviously being told, baby, Hebron's already signed away. This is the date you'll sign it away. This is when it will happen. So my friend, my flatmate, got this information, said tomorrow is the day, and indeed it was. So on the morning news, it was announced that the Cabinet were absolutely appalled. How could you do this to us? You promised. The Knesset were even more appalled. Then the people were saying, we voted for you because you said that you would never give away from Hebron. We should have voted for Perez. At least we knew he would. They just felt utterly, utterly betrayed. But I don't think he had a choice. He had a gun at his head. Henry Kissinger had given the orders, and, you don't disobey Henry Kissinger without there be... But that's what Rabin did.
So Henry Kissinger will be getting his orders from somebody above him, and he's the gopher that passes the orders on. Now,
absolutely.
we're getting running out of time, so we're going to end up having to come back and do another show to continue this, because I know we've got a lot more to cover. But before we do close up, so what about the Vatican's role in the old city of Jerusalem?
Now that is absolutely amazing, because the same friend who told me about, Hebron's going to be given away tomorrow, and indeed it was, on the night news, is the Israeli troops coming out, leaving the Israeli flag being pulled down, and Yasser Arafat and his troops taking over Hebron. So she told me that. The next thing she told me was about the Vatican deal. And she said that Perez and Arafat, both high-level Freemasons, had met with a high-level Freemason in the Vatican in 1993 in a secret agreement to hand over the old city to the jurisdiction of the Vatican. It was a secret deal. And really, Perez had no authority to do that. He wasn't prime minister, but she didn't know who it was who they signed the deal with in the Vatican. It wasn't until Cardinal Ratzinger became Pope that my John said, who is this guy Ratzinger? Let me do some research on him. And John's the best researcher I know. Anyway, he was reading through Ratzinger's history and said, Joy, this is the guy who Arafat and Perez signed that deal with, to give the old city of Jerusalem to the Vatican. And so when we were being shown through the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and all of the Catholic establishments in Jerusalem, we were told that they are getting ready everything for the Vatican to rule the old city. All the legal stuff is being put in place, all the administrative stuff is being put in place. And at the time of Godfrey of Bouillon, they were called Knights Guardians of the Holy Sepulchre, and they had white robes with a red cross, the red cross?
Yes.
And so now they are remaking those robes with their red cross on, and I can send you pictures, Tony.
Yeah.
And they're not called, it's almost identical title. It was Knights Guardians of the Holy Sepulchre. Now it's Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. So now it's almost identical name. The new robes are being made. The buildings are being put in place. Everything is ready for the Vatican to take over the rulership of the old city. And as John has also sent you, Tony, a picture of all of the so-called peace deals and who signed them.
Yeah.
One of those peace deals was to have Jerusalem as divide Jerusalem. West Jerusalem would be the capital of Israel, and East Jerusalem would be the capital of the Palestinian state. What wasn't stated in that was that the Vatican would have jurisdiction over the old city, and Arafat and then Abbas had made a secret deal with the Vatican. As soon as the old city, as soon as East Jerusalem is handed over to us, we absolutely promise and guarantee we will hand it over to you, the Vatican. So it was signed. It was signed in 93 by 3 Freemasons in a secret deal, and that's all on record now by a journalist called Joel Bannerman, which John's got the articles on that, but was also part of the Oslo Peace Accords. That was a 7-year treaty from 93. By 2000, Jerusalem was to be the international capital, the world religious capital, and the Vatican was going to have jurisdiction over Jerusalem as the world religious capital. But that was delayed, and because that was delayed, the Intifada started, and then all the bombings started, and that sort of plan got delayed. But everything's in place for it right now.
Wow. So, yeah, we're going to have to come back and do a second show to continue on this. But before we close off, John, have you got any sort of thoughts to add to what Joy has said here that might be interesting to our listeners to hear at the end of the show?
I think Joy's covered it all very well. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's cool. So, yeah, I want to say thanks to both of you for being on the Minute to Midnight show today, and we'll have to come back and do part 2 of this, perhaps in a week's time, if possible.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That'd be lovely,
Sounds
Tony.
good.
It's been lovely talking to you.
Okay, so that it's been fascinating, and like I say, I know you've sent me a lot more stuff too, so we have not even hardly scratched the surface. And then, of course, we've got the 5G show, so we'll probably end up with 3 interviews between now and Christmas, folks. So if you haven't already done so, make sure you're following us on our website and also our YouTube channel and so on. Mm-hmm. So thank you. Folks, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already done so. You can find our shows on iTunes, on YouTube, and of course on our website, aminutemidnight.com, with Midnite spelled MIDNITE. And we run A Minute to Midnight 100% by donations. We really appreciate people that do help us. Really, it's it's pretty tough for everyone financially at these stages, and so we really appreciate when people help us, because we couldn't run it without your help. And all the music I write, play and record, and you can download free music on our Minute to Midnight website if you want as well. And join our forum. We have a forum on aminutemidnight.com and also a Facebook group too. That's about it for today. We will catch you with another show in a few days' time. God bless and have a great week.